Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So, sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. Now that it's 1099 season, many of you are reminded of how you just didn't get around to making sure the information you collect from your vendors is sufficient and valid for tax reporting, nor how to make sure it stays that way. So, if you want 20 tips on how to handle your federal and state reportable vendors year round, keep listening. Welcome to episode 272, 20 tips for handling U.S. federal and state reportable vendors. Now, this podcast episode is actually a webinar that was recorded. It was originally live on Wednesday, November 8th, 2023, and it was sponsored by Financial Operations Networks. They have a vendor self-registration portal and then also a standalone tool for bank account validations, bank account ownership validations. So they sponsored it, and I went over 20 tips for handling U.S. and federal and state reportable vendors. And it was done in November so that you can get ready, the attendees could get ready for tax reporting, but it's actually really good for year round. So you can prepare your vendor's data, collect the right data, and then also prepare it for tax reporting. So it's 20 tips, and there were 3 tips for getting updated. There were 5 tips for collecting the right information. There were 4 tips on how to enter on the vendor record. There were 4 tips for your accounting system or ERP related to 1099 reporting. And then there were the last 4 tips were preparing for IRS tax filing. So, you know what? You might get a jump on next year, because I know that when this is published, which will be on Thursday, January 18th. And so many of you may already be in the throes or probably in the throes of the 1099 reporting, or maybe you're already done and now everything that you wanted to do is fresh in your head. And so this is a perfect time to listen to this podcast. Now, if you are at any time of the year, it's also a great time because it does give some great tips, again, that you can do year round, because I talk about collecting information, entering on the vendor record, and those types of things can be done at any time of the year. And actually, some of these tips and the other ones in the other categories too apply year round. So I am going to go ahead and put that on. Now, the actual webinar is still available on demand. So if you would like to instead or in addition to watch the recording, and also that will let you download the handouts. And one of the handouts is a really good one. It's from the sponsor, Financial Operations Networks, and they have a handout called Compliance Responsibilities in Vendor Setup, and it's actually very good. So I also have a PDF of the presentation. So I will put a link to that on-demand recording where you can download the handouts in the show notes. I'll also put a link, and I actually think it's been in there like all year, but I'll put a link to the 20 Tips in 20 Minutes series or webinar series. I did that all last year. This was one of them, but every month, and typically it was the third Wednesday of every month, but every month, so I have 12 of them that are on demand right now for 2023 with the 20 Tips in 20 Minutes formats. They are all 30 minutes long, so not an hour, 30 minutes. You get a quick 20 tips. All right, so here is the recording. All right, well, we are right at the top of the hour, and we are going to get started because I have a lot of information to share with you today. So welcome to this month's 20 Tips in 20 Minutes webinar series. And today we're going to be talking about or have 20 tips for you when handling U.S. federal and state reporting vendors. So it's all about the IRS and the state today. This webinar is sponsored by Financial Operations Networks, and my name is Debra Richardson. I'll come up with a really quick bio in just a minute, but I do want to talk about some housekeeping items. So this session is being recorded. Tomorrow about this time, you will receive a link that you can use to register for the recording if you want to watch it again, or maybe you just want to share it with some of your colleagues that you think will find this information helpful as well. And then for questions, make sure that you submit them as soon as you think about them. We will have some time at the end, probably up to 5 minutes for questions, but since we have such a limited time, I want to make sure you get those questions in beforehand so that I can start answering those right at the Q&A time period. If you have questions afterwards, or maybe you are watching this on demand, you can reach out via email to info@debrarrichardson.com, and you will be able to submit your question, and I'll respond within 24 hours. And then lastly, don't forget to download the handouts. I do have 3 handouts, I believe. So I have a PDF of this presentation. I also have a very great handout we'll talk about from Financial Operations Networks. It's 19 pages, and it's all on compliance in the vendor setup process, right? So make sure you download that. And then also I have my own PDF brochure. Now, a little bit about me. Again, my name is Debra Richardson. I used to be an AP Senior Manager over Global Vendor Setup and Maintenance, and I led a team of 17 team members, and all we did was vendor setup and maintenance. And so we processed 2,000 vendor setup requests per month, and we had 140,000 active vendors across 7 different ERPs. And each year during tax season, we sent out anywhere from 24 to 30,000 1099s and 1042s, and we printed all of those in-house. So you can imagine not everything was perfect, either from not properly identifying reportable vendors through to putting the 1099 forms in the wrong way. Yes, that happens. It also happened with checks too, by the way. But any event, so we had those issues and everything in between. So let's go ahead and get started so you can avoid some of the risks that results from bad handling of your reportable vendors. So let's take a look at the agenda. So first, we're going to go over 6 of the biggest risks of bad handling of U.S. federal and state reportable vendors. And then we're going to get into the lightning round of 20 tips in 20 minutes, ending up again with hopefully up to 5 minutes for Q&A. But first, I do have one poll question, and then this is the only poll question of the webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and launch it. And that question is very relevant to today's topic. Does your organization currently have a way to automatically perform TIN matching? And taxpayer identification, right? That matching is where you are verifying that the vendor legal name and their tax ID or taxpayer identification number matches what the IRS has on file. And I guess it's not, I was going to say strange, but maybe not so strange, because I still run into teams that do not do the IRS TIN match at vendor setup, believe it or not. So if you're one of those, you're not by yourself, but we are coming up to tax reporting season, so it's no time like the present to start. All right, so go ahead. Anyone hasn't cast your vote, go ahead and cast your vote. We've got about 85%, really good. Thank you guys. I'm going to go ahead and close it. And then let's share. All right, so it looks like 59% of you don't have a way to automatically validate, and 35% of you do. All right, so the 59% that don't have an automated way, and maybe even the 35%, we'll talk a little bit about vendor info and financial operations networks and what they have to offer in automating, right, the TIN match. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. And we're going to start off again by talking about the risk of bad handling of U.S. federal and state reportable vendors. And I may be preaching to the choir with some of these, but let's go ahead and start with the first one, right? So you have U.S. federal, state fines because you've either had late, inaccurate, or missing tax reporting, either the tax reporting overall or the data that you submitted is not correct, right? So that can lead to fines. So by the way, if you've checked out the IRS's penalty chart for this year, of course it has gone up. So if you haven't seen that, make sure you do. And then the next one is, right, the IRS will make your company liable for any missed withholding that you should have done before the first payment but did not do. And so if you have not determined or have not withheld from a vendor that should have been withheld from, you'll not only be responsible for what you should have withheld, but then also the penalties and interest that come along with that. And then, of course, this kind of goes with the first one, right? So the IRS, that whole B notice process, right? That manual process that you have to go through to collect a W-9 or correct W-9 from a vendor, where the IRS has, right, sent you a CP 2100, CP 2100A notification to say, hey, your vendor legal name, tax ID combination that you filed, or the tax ID was missing, right? And so now you've got to go back and follow their process, use their verbiage to collect that W-9 with corrected information. And for most of you, I know it was with us, right? That process was just very manual. And then the next one is late filing due to errors with the electronic file. Oh, and many of you probably already know this, that IRS has finally done it, right? They've been saying for years that they're going to reduce that threshold for requiring electronic filing from 250 down to 10. And so this year, that's exactly what they've done. So those folks that are new to electronic filing, right? Because now your company, right, is over that 10 threshold versus the 250. You want to make sure, just like those of you who have been electronic filing, that you collect the right vendor data so that you can correctly populate it into the electronic file. And you also want to make sure that the electronic file or the file that you use to file file electronically with the IRS can go or be uploaded smoothly into that system. And then the next one is not sending the vendor any or wrong tax reporting. So you can be fined, right, separately for not sending the vendor their 1099s or 1042s, or, right, if you send the wrong information. But if you do either one of those, even kind of worse, the immediate effect is that it's going to result in an influx of vendor calls for incorrect or missing tax forms. And you probably felt this pain before too, where, you know, it's just stressful to keep taking a large volume of calls from vendors that disagree with the amount that you reported on, or they're looking for their 1099, or they think they got one in error. So make sure that, so that's one of the risks of just having that bad data and handling it badly. Now, many of these risks really start with compliance at the time of vendor setup. And so a great resource is one of the handouts today. It's the compliance responsibilities in vendor setup from our sponsor, Financial Operations Networks. And it actually has 19 pages of great information on taxpayer identification numbers, TINs, watch lists, and more. And so these are all the things that, right, their vendor self-registration portal or standalone validation tool handles. And we'll talk more about that later. Now, let's jump into the 20 tips in 20 minutes. So this is going to be lightning speed, so let's go. All right, so the first one is under getting, make sure you get updated and actually stay updated, right? So the federal requirements, you need to be updated on what those requirements are. Each year, there are updates to the requirements. So we already talked about the change this year for the electronic filing requirement, but it can also be good too. Many of you, if you filed or was in the process last year, you noticed that the 1099 MISC and the 1099 NEC, right, were turned into a continuous form, right? So you can just write in the tax year. And so that helped a lot because now you don't have to get it just right, the quantity that you have to order. So it could be good updates. It could be updates that now you have to make changes to. This year was one of them with that electronic filing change. And then the same thing with the states, and probably more so with the states too, because each state is different. So you need to make sure that you know what states you have reportable vendors in. We used to pull all the reportable vendors and then identify what states that they were in, and then go to those state sites and verify what their requirements are. They can have different due dates, and like the IRS, they can change their requirements on an annual basis. So you want to make sure you stay up to date with that. And then for those of you that are new to electronic filing, everyone else can tell you, you need to make sure you review the requirements for the file that you're going to use, for example, to upload into the FIRE system, which is one of two options that the IRS has for electronic filing. And so for US vendors, you want to, or the 1099s, you want to check publication 1220. And then for the 1042S, for non-US or foreign vendors, you want to check publication 1187. Now, all of this starts with collecting the right information. And so you want to make sure, I'm just going to reveal both of these at the same time, that you are collecting the IRS W-9 or the IRS applicable W-8 forms. This is really one of the biggest mistakes I've seen when they are not collected, either for, you know, the assumption that they're not reportable, you don't need the W-9, but A great example are corporations, right? Corporations can be reportable based on the type of payment that's being made. And so you definitely want to collect the W-9 for any corporations. And then if we flip that to the foreign side or non-US side, corporations don't have that automatic exemption, right? So you always want to make sure that you're collecting that information from the vendor on the W-9 and W-8. And then when you get them, know when to send them back. So if the forms are not signed when they're required to be, if they didn't give you a tax ID or a TIN number, right? You want to make sure you send it back. If they selected LLC, that's another big one. That limited liability company, LLC, but they don't tell you whether they're a corporation, a S corporation, C corporation, or a partnership, right? They don't put the letters in there so that you know how they're going to be taxed, because that could make the difference of being reportable and not reportable. So know when you need to send those back. And then when you get a valid W-9 or W-8, you want to make sure you perform the vendor, the IRS TIN match for vendor setup and also at vendor changes. Because sometimes the reason that, let's say they're sending you a change in remittance is because they've merged or been acquired and they know they need to change their payment, right? But they may not know that they need to give you their new legal name or their new tax ID. So make sure you perform it when you're changing existing vendor data on the vendor record as well. And then know how to determine if the vendor is reportable and or withholdable. And right, so sometimes, well, you have to look at both the tax classification and then sometimes the payment type can make that vendor reportable even if the tax classification indicates they're not reportable. Great example again is with the corporations, right? If certain types of payments are reportable, whether they're corporations or not. And that information is in that compliance handout from Financial Operations Network. So make sure you download that. All right, so let's talk about some tips, best practices on the vendor record. So the first one is make sure you enter the vendor legal name in the correct field, right? Because entering it in the correct field means that it's going to pull into that output file that you're going to use for electronic filing correctly. And some of you, right, all ERPs, accounting systems are different, right? Some of you have separate fields for that. For pulling into the files, and some of you have it in just your regular vendor legal name field. So know what that is for your accounting system or ERP. And the same thing with the DBA. Have a spot or a field or a convention for how you enter that, especially those of you that don't have a separate DBA field, know how that needs to be entered. Also, make sure that wherever you're entering that DBA, that it's not going to pull into that output file that you're going to use for electronic filing, because the DBA and the tax ID are not going to match. You want to make sure your legal name is in the correct field. Also, just make sure yourself and the team, right, knows how to indicate on the vendor record that that vendor is reportable. And some of you have specific fields or drop downs to select the correct box as well on the vendor record. And then know how to process withholding for withholdable vendors. I will tell you that with all those vendors that we maintain across those 7 ERPs, only one ERP had an automatic withholding process. Everything else we had to do when we had to withhold, it was a manual process. But you do need to know how to do that so that it can be done so you don't get fined by the IRS for not withholding. And then accounting system or ERP, right? If you have an embedded 1099 form or 1042S form. We had a couple of those. Make sure that technically they're a substitute 1099, so make sure that if there are changes on the 1099 MISC or NEC or any other form that you have embedded, that you update those in your system as well. And then every year too, right, there are always ERP annual updates. So there'll be updates from the provider of your accounting software or your ERP, and make sure that you test the system following those annual updates. Also, make sure you test the file generated, again, for the IRS FIRE system, both that output file from your accounting system or ERP, and then the upload of that file into the IRS's test FIRE system ahead of time to make sure that you're not late because you're running into errors. And then many of you following the 1099 NEC a couple of years back still have it in your accounting system or ERP where let's say box 7 that was on the 1099 MISC, that's still there. It's not reflecting that it's should be box 1 of the 1099 NEC. And so maybe it's pulling correctly, maybe it's not, but you want to make sure that you test that and that you also get that updated. All right, so the last 4 have to do with preparing for the IRS tax filing. So again, you want to make sure you do your IRS 10 match at vendor setup when you're changing vendors. And then also do that bulk upload, right? Or if you don't have a large volume, you can do it one by one, but you want to check it again because sometimes the vendors have had no changes, right? But they've merged or been acquired or changed your vendor legal name with the IRS. They may not notify you, or maybe they did notify someone in your company, right? The person they have a relationship with, but that information did not get to the vendor team. So make sure you are doing that IRS 10 match before you start populating those 1099s and before you do your tax filing. And then determine if you can use the newest electronic filing option from the IRS. It's called IRIS, and I did have it's intake something, but it's the second filing option. It's right now it is really for the smaller filers, but I have put a link to publication 5717, so 5717, so you can get more information on it. Keep in mind though, if you're looking at FIRE versus IRIS, IRIS at this point can only do 1099s. It can't do 1042Ss, but you do have 2 options that you can check and see if IRIS is one of them. Now, speaking of electronic filing, right, especially those of you who will be doing it this time for the first time because of the lower threshold, then you need to make sure that you get your transmitter control code, and that will allow you to file electronically. Now, even if you have a legacy TCC, right? You already have one. If you had one that was issued prior to September 26, 2021 and did not go through the application process by August 1st, 2023 to retain that same TCC, now you've got to go through the application process. You can still get one, it's just going to be a different one. And then also note that you might need different TCCs based on things like the number of files you're going to send. You'll need a separate TCC for the IRIS system versus the FIRE system. Some of you may be using both, right? And so you'll need separate TCCs for that. You'll need a separate TCC for filing 1099s. You'll need a separate TCC for filing 1042s. So we used to always take an inventory, right? So make sure you do that and make sure that you do it now because because the process date for those applications, if you have to submit one, is about 45 days. And then the last one is to make sure you generate a frequently asked questions for your help desk to handle those vendor inquiries, because you know they're coming starting February 1, right? So make sure that you have that available. And what that really does is it allows your staff to access the responses quickly, and they're all given the same response. So no more calling multiple people so you can get a better response, right? They're all given the same response. And it's really good for training too, because the responses are right there for them to copy and paste in the email or to read as a script. Wow, that was a lot. So 20 tips in 20 minutes. So I hope some of those tips will help you in getting ready for tax reporting season. And as we said before, we know it all starts with vendor onboarding and having a way to revalidate that information before you file. And that's really where, right, the vendor info platform comes in from financial operations networks, and how it can help not only with collecting the right information and validating it at vendor setup and when vendors update their information, but right, that can help you with tax reporting. But they also offer bank account validation, because you know the end of the year and tax season brings out the fraudsters. So you can click on each for more information or contact them using the email or phone number that is on the screen. And then I do have a slide here to for how you can connect with me. I do have a YouTube channel where I post the Vendor Master File Tip of the Week. I've got a couple videos on that IRIS system too, so you might want to check that out. All right, so we do have 5 minutes. I did good today, 5 whole minutes for questions and answers. And so if you want to go ahead and throw questions in the question section, I will go ahead and respond to that. All right, so we do have a question in about a new W-9. Is there a new IRS form W-9? And so yes and no. The IRS did issue a draft version of the W-9, and that draft version has a revision date of October 2023. However, they have still not published it yet. So currently, the most current published version is has a revision date of October 2018, and so hopefully you're using that version. But I would keep checking, right, to make sure when the IRS publishes the draft version, and that draft version, by the way, has been out since July 26th of 2023. But when they get around to publishing that you then start collecting the right version of that W-9. So make sure that you keep up to date on that. So yes and no is there a new W-9? And by the way, the changes that they made on the W-9 does not affect the reportability really at all. It's really 2 changes. They spelled out single member LLC to single member limited liability company in that first tax class. And then they also added a checkbox for those that are partnerships or trusts and estates to identify if they have any foreign owners or beneficiaries. So not a lot that's going to affect your tax reporting. And then speaking of tax reporting, so we do have another question about how do we tell if a vendor is reportable. And so I said just really high level, right? It depends on the tax classification, but then it also depends on the type of payment as well. I gave the example of a corporation who by tax class, right, is not reportable. However, maybe they have some reportable payments, right, that are medical or healthcare, right? Those payments are reportable whether or not
they're a corporation, right? So it's one of the exceptions. And so you really have to look at both. Or another example, we'll flip it. We have a vendor that is in that first tax class, sole proprietor, single member LLC, individual, that is a reportable vendor, but then the payments are for goods and those are not reportable, so you don't have to report them. A great resource again for that is the handout from Financial Operations Networks, the compliance at vendor setup. And so that has a lot of information in there about reportable vendors and also, right, about the 1099 reporting, the 1099 forms for reporting. So make sure you check that out. All right, so 1 minute left, and I don't see any additional questions, so I want to have a last call for questions. We do have time for at least one more, but I do want to remind you, especially if you are watching on demand, that you can send your questions via email to info@debrarrichardson.com, and it will be responded to within 24 hours. And a reminder also that tomorrow this time, you will receive an email with a link to register for the recording, where you can also, on the left-hand side, download the handouts in that platform as well. And feel free to share that with any of your colleagues that were not able to make it or that would find some of this information helpful. All right, so we are right at the end time. So I want to thank everyone for attending today, and watch out for the email tomorrow with a link to the recording and where you can also download the handouts. So everyone, have a great rest of your day. Thanks for showing up, and see you next month.
I hope you enjoyed that. Maybe you got some tips out of there that you can use in your current process to make next year's tax reporting season just a little bit easier. So, thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 272nd episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.